Over the years, I've become obsessed with finding the perfect Zelda 2 ROM hack. The NES game has always been one of my favorites with its relatively dark atmosphere, gigantic overworld, and addictive mechanics. It's a sequel that is on par with the original in my eyes, despite all of its differences. My biggest problem with a lot of Adventure of Link fan projects is that they often rely too heavily on difficulty. A healthy challenge is good, but when things start to become unfair, with obtuse progress-halting gimmicks and traps, I typically get turned off. If I've learned anything from my review of the last Zelda 2 ROM hack I covered on this channel, it's that people come to these unofficial releases with different expectations. A lot of speedrunners and proficient players want to get involved with something that is exponentially more demanding of their skills, and I get that. I respect it, but personally, I'm looking for a balanced experience that ramps up gradually, a second quest equivalent to the original game's difficulty, something that is manageable, compelling, and most of all, fun. The Legend of Zelda Winter Solstice nails everything I'm looking for in a ROM hack, almost. This late 2020 release by GTM604 is so close to being the perfect successor to The Adventure of Link. It has had its icy claws in me since the moment I booted it up. This is a beautifully stylized Zelda 2 experience from top to bottom, with a lot of heart, but it does have a few ridiculous flaws that prevent it from being perfect. Fortunately, the majority of these hiccups occur very late in the game, which is good because you'll likely be hooked by the time you reach them. When I got to the silly bits, I was already invested and the issues I faced weren't nearly enough to turn me off entirely, but we'll get there in due time. Let's kick this thing off with everything Winter Solstice does well. First and foremost, this ROM hack looks beautiful. The majority of the assets are lifted directly from the source material, but slightly altered to suit the winter theme. Swamps are now deep mounds of snow that impede movement. Town windows are framed with frost, and the entire landscape from the map perspective is covered in white. The attention to detail is remarkably consistent as the action areas visually represent the winter theme, and the traps that inhabit them suitably rely more on fragile, disintegrating grounds. Link's sprite is the most obvious difference here as he dons a warm coat with a cape that clearly shows the Triforce symbol and a hood that gets removed in specific areas. Brilliant. Fireplaces in villages now have Zelda 1 flames to keep the townsfolk warm, and all of these people offer up clues in clear English. From beginning to end, there are noticeable touches to the world that give it an authentic feel. Rivers, lakes, and fountains are frozen over. Rooftops are capped with snow. It's all perfect, and immediately made me feel like I was exploring a new world. The most interesting changes are in how the palaces are designed. In the official title, these areas are all great, but there aren't many discernible differences between them. The NES version improved on the Famicom original by adding new color schemes to these environments. It certainly helped in making them distinguishable from one another, but thematically they all just felt like nondescript, boxy labyrinths. The palaces in Winter Solstice are all artistically unique, and the large majority of them also introduce some very clever puzzle gimmicks. If it's not clear already, I highly recommend this ROM hack, so I won't spoil any of the specifics here, but to give you a few ideas, one of these palaces is built on some unstable ground, which results in some challenging platforming as things crumble beneath Link's feet. A few others have mysterious, necessary paths to discover. Any one of these inclusions could have ruined the game if they weren't handled properly, but none of them entered that hazy realm of unnecessary confusion that other ROM hacks deliver. The townsfolk will often give you a helpful hint, but even if you ignore chatting, as I do, the puzzles can all be solved with a reasonable reasonable amount of logic. Sure, I got stuck a few times, but there are enough clues within the environments to give you an idea of what to do. For instance, in this case, I can clearly see that there's an area down below that I can get to, but there aren't any direct paths to access it. The structures themselves show you the way, and oftentimes when you've made a mistake, there will be an exit to inform you that you're going about it all wrong. There were aha moments I had during my time with Winter Solstice that I rarely experience from ROM hacks of Zelda 2, because the majority of the time, these things are built by people who just want to mess with you. It's not satisfying when the solution is too bizarre or needlessly obtuse. I felt good about solving these tiny puzzles because they were well designed, and didn't have me jumping through hoops. These 2D action set pieces also include a lot of cleverly crafted platforming challenges. The majority of them revolve around disintegrating floors, as I mentioned before. Basically, there will be an item or an exit that needs to be reached in a single pass. These sequences require some skill with some relatively advanced knowledge of the mechanics. They shake things up, and I think they're an excellent addition. After a while, they do get quite repetitive, but more on that later. For the most part, I enjoy the way they are designed. Specifically this one that forces you to make deliberate jumps back and forth as the ground gives way. Failure results in death, but losing all of Link's lives isn't all that bad, since Winter Solstice follows the Famicom rules. It sends you back to the entrance of a palace instead of the beginning of the game. Yeah, you'll still lose all of your experience points, but not having to trek across the entire world is such a beautiful thing. The Overworld map is well conceived, with enough safe havens and explorable areas to poke around in from the get-go. There's a clear and obvious path forward, but enough freedom so things rarely feel restrictive. It's possible to get lost in a maze of tunnels before the first item can even be found, which really opens things up. Naturally, you'll be expected to follow the beats laid out, but a few sequences can be broken and the fills are all yours. Link nabs a pair of ice skates early in the adventure, which makes it possible to get around on rivers and lakes. The pace of the game is so perfect that by the end I was left wanting more. Similarly to the official release, things get a bit narrower in the final stretch, but a journey has to be over sometime, and I haven't found a Zelda 2 hack that has managed to nail this as well as Winter Solstice. It has a familiar look, but it's a world I didn't want to stop exploring. All of the standard action scenes are laid out in interesting ways, with a handful of new textures and borrowed assets from the first NES title. The enemies are largely the same as those from the source game, but they are well placed for the most part. On the rare occasion, a new variation of an existing foe will pop up with a different palette swap. The statues from the first Zelda make an appearance as yet another aerial assailant in a game packed with more than its fair share, but it's not enough to have an impact either way. I'd be lying if I said it wouldn't have been nice to see a few more brought over or some extra original sprites, but I'm not exactly complaining either. You start things off with less health and magic, but the difficulty is balanced well enough that this shouldn't be an issue. It allows for more exploration, as you'll need to locate more containers throughout the world. Some are tucked away in tricky spots, but I managed to find them all on my first run, so I'd say they are placed in reasonable locations that flow well with the pace of the game. It's much easier to discern how much energy a spell will drain from your bar, as each use is divided into chunks for the most part. Experience dropped by enemies has been altered quite a bit, but there are more big baddies to take down from the start, so it feels balanced. Definitely more challenging, but well thought out. Wandering around in caves is a big deal in Zelda 2, and Winter Solstice is no different, only here you'll have to make your way through a good chunk without the aid of a light source. Enemies appear as shadows, and platforms can be seen in the majority of these areas, but there are some pitch black ones later on in the game. These start cropping up near the candle, which is an item that is tucked away in a hidden area that requires a few upgrades to nab. The sequence of events that lead up to this perfectly illustrates my point regarding this game's design, and how it guides the player without ever holding their hand. Unlike many Adventure of Link detractors, I've never had a problem with the title's rare, obtuse moments. I was able to see the end credits as a dumb kid without a guide of any sort, so I really can't sympathize with those who consider it to be an insurmountable experience. That being said, this ROM hack definitely offers up enough clues organically to make it a non-issue for those who can't be bothered to strain their brains. There's a lot of interesting bits to enjoy in Winter Solstice, whether it be the clever way it handles a few of the brief fetch quests within towns to the way it subverts expectations when it comes to palace layouts. I'm particularly fond of the way it has you collect the crucifix and water in order to gain passage to the wise men, who offer up new spells. The palace is no longer turned to stone once the item and boss have been cleared out, which is a nice touch for those who want to return for experience points. It's a well-built ROM hack, so grinding shouldn't be necessary, but the option is there. A few of the boss battles are very fun with brand new twists. I'm a big fan of the Karok encounter, as it now mixes up the attack pattern a bit, as it occasionally hovers in the air. It's a simple change, but one that makes the fight infinitely more engaging. There's a surprise encounter with Robonac that also shakes things up, as it can occur before obtaining the downward thrust. Winter Solstice has a lot of surprises that I can get behind, but unfortunately, I do have some gripes, and the majority of them have to do with the bosses. Let's start with the Mazura, or Horsehead battle in the first palace. I mean, come on. I get what they were going for here, and it's an interesting fight, but just look at this, people. It's goofy as all hell. The inclusion of the blue iron knuckle forces the player to think outside the box, and the two work well in conjunction with one another, but the floating big bad is extremely silly. Beyond that, I think it cheapens the experience, especially so early on in the game. Let's be honest, the majority of fan hacks aren't that good. Most of them do crazy little things like stacking enemies like this, but they're often done for a laugh or due to incompetence. Winter Solstice is a quality game, and this isn't a good first boss impression regardless of how fun it is. While we're still on the bosses, I've got to bring up the Barba and Thunderbird duels, which take place on platforms over death pits. It's far too easy to get knocked into the chasms, which is a problem in and of itself, but the biggest issue is that the key to exit the serpent creature's room can drop into the abyss if the central platform corrodes. This must have been an unintentional oversight because it's far too cruel, even for a ROM hack, and is a punishment that will likely turn some people off. Speaking of corrosion, there is one late game palace that requires some very tricky runs in order to nab keys to progress. Like I said, these platform puzzles are well designed and exciting, but this exact room is repeated at least half a dozen times, with the only difference being the variety of enemies that inhabit it. The sequence was fun to play through once, maybe twice, but after that it just felt lazy, which is the same thing that can be said for the final palace as a whole. There's a real copy-paste thing going on here, and it's an enormous labyrinth that loses its appeal after 10 minutes or so. On a positive note, there are seashells that become much more predominant in the final stretch of the game, which act as extra lives. Maybe they also work as collectibles or something, but I couldn't find anyone to give them to, so I think they're just one-ups. It's fine and all, but they also feel a bit like an apology from the creators of this ROM hack for making a few of these later stages so goddamn repetitive. Also, from an extremely subjective point of view, I could have done without the low health beeping. It's a thing everyone bitches about, I know, and I'm not trying to be cute, because I'm more of a handsome type of guy, but enough is enough with the beeping already. This might be a spoiler, but the majority of the music is the same as that from The Adventure of Link, but the final palace and the last boss battle include 2 original tracks. These are excellent arrangements that suit the tone of the game perfectly. I know that it's a big ask for a ROM hack to have an entirely original soundtrack, but hearing these themes really did leave me wanting more. While we're talking about the end, I must say the final cutscene is also drawn extremely well and makes the game worth completing. I'm aware that this is a finished project, but I really do believe that it could be perfect if some of that boss battle nonsense and the repetition could be tweaked. Still, as it stands, Winter Solstice is a damn fine ROM hack that I can't recommend enough. The pacing, palace designs, and overall style of this package is second to none as far as I'm concerned. It had its hooks in me immediately and rarely disappointed. The overworld was an absolute joy to explore, the puzzles were clever, and the platforming challenges were all on point. Play this game, people. From what I can tell, GTM604 worked on the design, CF207 did the primary hacking and ASM work, with Bent Glass Tube being the composer. It can be found on romhacking.net for free. Yes, I said .net instead of .com. The internet can be tricky, and I wouldn't want to be corrected again for erroneously uttering anything that could be confusing. And no, I won't sing to you. Next time on this channel, 2022 and another NES Zelda ROM hack. So stay tuned.
Enough. My ship sails in the morning. I wonder what's for dinner.
Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok!